We are going to be tackling a pretty fundamental shift in architecture, the move towards this collaborative, interdisciplinary design, and we've gathered insights from a bunch of different places for this one, so we can really dive into it.
Yeah, I think one of the big changes that's happening in architecture that's really pushing this forward is that the problems that architecture has to deal with now are just so complex.
Right.
It's not just about designing a visually beautiful building.
Yeah.
It's about thinking about environmental responsibility, really understanding the cultural context, integrating new technologies, and it's become clear that no single architect or even a single firm can really hold all the expertise that's needed.
Right.
So what we're going to look at today is how this idea of interdisciplinary collaboration is really changing the field. And we're not just talking about cooperation; we're talking about really merging diverse minds together to come up with much more holistic solutions.
Okay, so let's take a step back for a second and think about the history of architecture and how different people have worked together to actually build structures. Because this idea of different people working together on buildings is not exactly new, is it?
No, it's definitely not new. I mean, you think about the way something like a medieval cathedral was built. You had these master builders, and they would coordinate with stonemasons and carpenters and glassmakers. They'd have a whole range of people with really specialized skills all working together. But it was pretty hierarchical. The master builder really had the ultimate control over the vision and the execution.
Right. So impressive coordination for sure,
yeah.
But not necessarily the kind of back and forth dialogue about the design itself.
Exactly. Yeah. It wasn't necessarily about everyone coming around a table and brainstorming different ideas for the design.
Right.
And actually, if you jump forward a bit to the Renaissance, that's a kind of interesting point of contrast, because you had someone like Leonardo da Vinci, who was an artist, an engineer, an anatomist, all these different things.
Right.
So he sort of embodied this kind of cross-disciplinary understanding within himself.
Yeah, a one-man show.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So he his genius sort of blurred all those lines, but it wasn't necessarily the same kind of team-based model that we're talking about today. It was more like an internal dialogue within one really versatile mind.
So almost like one person, interdisciplinary thinking.
Right.
But then things shifted again, right? When we think about the 20th century, things started to change a bit more.
Yeah, exactly. I think the 20th century brought with it a much greater professionalization of architecture and all these different fields. So you had people who specialized. You had structural engineers who really focused on how to make buildings stand up. You had landscape architects who were thinking about the site, HVAC engineers who were thinking about climate control, urban planners thinking about the broader context.
Everyone had their own niche.
Exactly. And I think architects like Walter Gropius and Le Corbusier, who were very much part of that modernist movement, they really recognized this growing specialization. And they were actually some of the first to really champion the idea of having coordinated teams, having integrated workflows. So they were really laying the foundation for the kind of interdisciplinary practices that we see as so essential today.
Okay, so let's define that then. What exactly is collaborative interdisciplinary design, as it exists now? It has to be more than just a bunch of experts sharing office space, right?
Right. Yeah, it's more about creating this shared journey,
right.
Really, where all these different kinds of expertise are, actively shaping each stage of a project from the very first idea, from the first spark of inspiration, all the way through to when it's actually built and being used. So some of the key elements here, you need deep respect for what each discipline brings. You need really clear communication. No one's talking past each other. You have well-defined goals, shared responsibilities, and a real commitment to solving problems together, drawing on everyone's knowledge.
Okay, so respect, communication, shared goals, collective problem solving. This all sounds like a pretty good recipe for a good outcome in any field. But what is it that makes it interdisciplinary?
Yeah, I think that the really key difference here is this idea of truly merging knowledge.
Right.
It's not just about dividing up the tasks and having the specialists work in silos. Right. It's about actively taking the insights and the methods from each different professional area and blending them together and tackling these design challenges from multiple angles.
Right.
And the aim here is that the final result, is something synergistic. It's something that's richer and more effective than if each discipline had just worked independently.
Right.
It's less like a group of musicians all playing their own solo and more like a band really creating a complex, harmonious piece together.
Yeah, it's like the whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Exactly.
So for anyone who's listening, what are the real nuts and bolts of making this kind of collaboration happen on an actual project? What are some of the key ingredients?
Well, I think one of the most important things is to bring all the team members, all the relevant team members in very early, like right at the beginning, the initial concept stage.
Right.
You don't want the structural engineers seeing the design for the first time when it's 90% done. Then it's about communication. Having really open communication and crucially jargon-free communication.
Right.
So everyone really understands each other.
Right.
I think shared tools are really important now. So things like building information modeling, which is BIM, or collaborative project management software, those play a huge role in keeping everyone on the same page.
Especially that jargon-free point, right? I can just imagine the different languages that maybe an urban planner uses versus a mechanical engineer.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
they might as well be speaking different languages sometimes.
Right.
And then there's this need for flexibility and real empathy.
Right.
Understanding that each discipline has its own kind of ways of working, its own timelines, priorities, and being willing to adapt to that.
Right.
And then really at the heart of it all, you need a really clear and shared vision. What is this project trying to achieve? What are the core values? How are we going to measure success?
Everyone has to be on board with where this thing's headed.
Exactly.
So let's actually break down some of those different players that we're talking about here. I think it's easy to think about architects and engineers,
right.
But it sounds like it's actually a much wider cast of characters now.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, think about the range of expertise that goes into a modern building project. You've got your structural, mechanical, and electrical engineers,
right?
And they're the ones who are fundamental in actually making the design a physical reality. Yeah. They figure out how it stands up, how it's heated and cooled, how the power works. And they have to balance all of that with the aesthetic goals, the safety regulations, and the realities of the budget.
Right.
They're the ones making sure that the architect's vision doesn't literally fall apart.
They are the unsung heroes, making sure the beautiful design is also functional and safe.
Exactly.
So then you have urban planners. What do they bring to the table?
Yeah. So urban planners, they bring that really vital understanding of context. So thinking about things like zoning laws, transportation networks, how this building connects to the surrounding city or town.
Right.
Then you've got landscape architects who are thinking about the relationship between the building and nature.
Right.
Designing green spaces, managing rainwater, making sure that the outdoor areas are usable and enjoyable.
And with the increasing focus on climate change and everything, I would imagine environmental consultants are playing a much more central role now.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. They're advising on everything from how to maximize energy efficiency, how to choose sustainable materials, assessing the project's ecological footprint, even modeling scaling its resilience to future climate conditions.
Wow.
And then moving inside, you've got interior designers, and they're focusing on the human experience at a much more personal level. You know, thinking about how spaces flow, the impact of color, ergonomic considerations, and just creating a really cohesive and functional environment for the people who are actually going to be using the building.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing to think about how many different facets there are to consider in just a single building. And you mentioned this earlier, but social scientists and community representatives, that feels like a really significant shift.
Yeah, I think it reflects a growing awareness of how much impact architecture has on people, you know, on a social level.
Right.
And I think social scientists, you know, they can bring really valuable insights into cultural values, how people behave in spaces,
right,
and involving community representatives. You know, that ensures that the design really reflects the needs and the aspirations of the people who are going to be living or working in the building.
Right.
And I think it leads to much more participatory design approaches, where the end users are actually involved in shaping the outcome.
Designing with the people, not just for them.
Exactly.
So what about technology? You mentioned data scientists before.
Oh yeah, data scientists and technologists, they're playing a bigger role. They're analyzing data about, you know, how people use spaces or data about the site itself,
right,
to inform a more, you know, evidence-based design.
Right.
They might use parametric modeling, which is where elements of the design are controlled by algorithms. They might oversee really advanced digital fabrication techniques. And, you know, we shouldn't forget artists and cultural practitioners, because they bring these, you know, really vital aesthetic and narrative and symbolic dimensions to a project.
Right.
So they can really help to ground it in the local identity and give it that deeper cultural resonance.
So it really does seem like architecture is this incredibly dynamic and responsive field now that's being shaped by all these different kinds of knowledge and insight. So let's get practical again. How do these teams actually work together on a day-to-day basis? Are there specific methods or processes they follow?
Yeah, there are some really key collaborative design methodologies that have emerged and become really important. I think one of the foundational ones is what's called integrated design process, or IDP.
IDP.
And this is a very holistic approach that really emphasizes getting all the stakeholders involved from the very start,
right from the very beginning.
Yeah. And the idea here is that by bringing everyone together early, you encourage a much more comprehensive way of thinking about the whole system. You reduce the need for you know, doing expensive revisions later down the line, and you also tend to get much better environmental performance.
Right.
And actually, this is why IDP is often a really key component of things like green building certifications, like LED or Green Star. It's very much baked into that approach.
And it seems like early and frequent communication is really kind of a recurring theme here.
Yeah, definitely.
So what else? What else is really crucial for successful collaboration?
I think another really big one is building information modeling, so BIM, which we mentioned before.
Right, yeah.
And this is really a game changer. You can think of it as this incredibly detailed digital model of the entire project that every member of the team can access and contribute to.
Right.
And it's not just a 3D drawing. It contains all this information about the building's components, the materials, the costs, how it's going to perform. And what this does is it really improves coordination. It helps to identify clashes early on.
Right.
You know, so maybe there's a duct that's going to run into a structural beam or something. You can catch that in the design phase.
You can avoid those issues down the line.
Exactly. And you can also do real-time updates. You can do performance simulations. It really creates this level of transparency and shared understanding that you just couldn't get with, you know, traditional two-dimensional drawings. And I think one of the most valuable things that BIM does is it forces those early conversations that sometimes can be a little bit uncomfortable, you know, where different disciplines have to really confront the realities of what each other are dealing with, and that prevents a lot of major headaches later on.
Right. So BIM is like the central nervous system for the information about the project. Make sure that everyone's working from the same data. So what about those really intensive workshops that we hear about sometimes, the design shirts?
Yeah. So design shirts are basically these very focused, high energy brainstorming sessions, often over several days. And they bring the multidisciplinary team together. They might bring other stakeholders in, and the goal is to generate and critique design ideas. They're great for sparking creativity, for getting that early alignment on the core goals.
Right.
And I think they're particularly valuable for public projects, things like parks, libraries, community centers, where it's really important to get input from the future users.
Right. The people who are actually going to be using those spaces.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's a way to kind of condense a lot of collaborative thinking into a very short, intensive period.
Okay. And we talked about this a little bit before, but I want to go a little bit deeper into co-design and participatory design, and how those approaches specifically foster, you know, a collaborative environment.
Yeah. So these methodologies are really all about bringing the non-professional stakeholders, so the people who are actually going to be using the building or the space, into the process, and really valuing them as collaborators.
Right.
So this could be future residents of, you know, an affordable housing project. It could be community members in a park project. It could be patients or medical staff in a hospital.
Right.
And the tools they use are really varied. It could be as simple as interviews or mapping exercises. It could involve you know, more immersive techniques like virtual reality walkthroughs, storytelling workshops, all sorts of things. And the goal here is to ensure that, you know, there's equity in the design process, and that there's representation, and that the spaces really meet people's needs and reflect their values.
Right.
And I think this is especially important in things like social housing, projects serving indigenous communities, you know, healthcare facilities, public spaces.
So we've talked a lot about how this collaboration happens in architectural design. I think it would be interesting to shift gears a little bit and think about why it's so essential.
Yeah.
You know, what are the real tangible benefits of taking this interdisciplinary route?
Well, I think the advantages are pretty substantial. First of all, as we've been talking about, it leads to much more holistic solutions.
Right.
So by bringing together all this different knowledge and these different perspectives, the team can really develop outcomes that aren't just technically sound, but they're also environmentally responsible. They're socially equitable. They're culturally relevant.
Right.
It's a much more kind of comprehensive and thoughtful approach to building.
Right. So you're not just ending up with a building that's structurally sound. Yeah. It's one that actually contributes positively to the environment, the community, the well-being of the people who use it.
Exactly.
So it's kind of like a win-win in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And the second big benefit is that this kind of collaboration, it really drives innovation and creativity.
Okay.
You know, when you put people together who think in different ways and who have different areas of expertise, it creates this really fertile ground for the cross-pollination of ideas.
Right.
So, you know, for example, you might have a structural engineer who's challenging the architect's vision with, you know, practical reality. You might have an artist who's pushing the boundaries of what's even possible aesthetically.
Right.
And, you know, feedback from the community can completely reshape the project in ways that you wouldn't have anticipated.
Right.
And this collision of perspectives, it can lead to some really novel designs.
So it makes perfect sense that these different viewpoints are going to spark possibilities that wouldn't have emerged if everyone was just working in their own little silo.
Yeah.
What about more nuts and bolts practical considerations, things like, managing budgets, keeping the project on schedule.
Yeah, well, I think one of the really interesting things about interdisciplinary collaboration is that it actually can help with that.
Okay.
Because if you get early input from the engineers, from the environmental consultants, even from the contractors, you can identify problems while you're still in the design phase. And that can really minimize those, costly construction delays, the budget overruns, the technical issues that often come up later down the line.
So it's like catching a small problem before it becomes a huge problem.
Exactly. So spending a bit more time on collaboration up front can actually save you time and money in the long run.
And avoid those headaches.
Exactly. And then, another really important benefit is stakeholder buy-in. When the people who are actually going to be using the space are involved in designing it, they develop this much stronger sense of ownership and pride in the final outcome. And that leads to, better long-term stewardship, a greater sense of community investment in the built environment.
Right.
And then finally, for the professionals themselves, working in these teams is a huge opportunity for learning.
Okay.
You gain new perspectives, you develop new skills by interacting with all these different disciplines.
Right.
And you become a much more well-rounded and effective collaborator yourself.
So it seems like it's a win-win-win.
Yeah, pretty much.
Everyone benefits. Let's talk about some actual examples. You mentioned the High Line in New York before.
Yeah.
Can we dig into that one a little bit more?
Yeah, I think the High Line is a really inspiring example of successful interdisciplinary collaboration. This was a project that involved landscape architects, so James Cornfield operations architects, Diller Scofidio plus Renfro, all sorts of community groups, and the New York City Department of Parks. Wow. And they came together and transformed this abandoned elevated railway line into this incredibly vibrant and really, really well-loved public park.
Right.
And I think what made it successful wasn't just preserving the historical structure, but it was really about reimagining this urban space.
Right.
And that was only possible because they had all these different perspectives coming together and challenging these traditional notions of what a park could be. And I think the level of community involvement was also crucial.
Right, because you have to make sure that the space serves the needs of the people.
Exactly.
Are there other examples that really highlight the power of this collaborative approach?
Yeah, another one is the Khoo Teck Puat Hospital in Singapore.
Okay.
And in this case, the collaboration was mainly between the architects, the hospital administrators, the healthcare professionals.
Right.
So the doctors, the nurses, the people who actually work there.
Right.
And the environmental engineers. And the whole design was really driven by this idea of creating an environment that would actually promote healing. Okay. Both for the patients and for the staff. So they incorporate all these biophilic design principles, lots of natural ventilation, natural light, greenery everywhere.
Wow.
And this was in a context that is usually very sterile and clinical.
Yeah.
So they were really thinking about how the physical space could actually contribute to recovery and well-being.
Yeah, it's a really interesting application of this kind of interdisciplinary lens to health outcomes.
Yeah.
And you mentioned another one before too, right?
Yeah, the final example is the Edge, which is in Amsterdam.
Okay.
And this one involved POP Architecture, Deloitte, which was the main tenant of the building, Bream Sustainability Consultants, and even software engineers. And they all worked together in this really integrated way, and they created this incredibly smart, connected building.
Wow.
Real-time environmental monitoring, really flexible office layouts, sophisticated digital infrastructure that can actually adapt to the needs of the people using it. And I think what's interesting about the Edge is that the real power of BIM in this project wasn't just about visualizing things, but it was about forcing those early conversations between the different disciplines, even when they were a bit uncomfortable.
Right.
And it helped to unearth all these fundamental design conflicts that could have been really costly if they hadn't been addressed early on.
Right. So instead of sweeping them under the rug and hoping that no one notices, you're actually addressing those issues head on.
Exactly.
These examples are all really, really inspiring, and they really highlight the potential of this kind of design. But I can imagine, bringing all these different viewpoints together, all these priorities, that it can't always be smooth sailing. What are some of the challenges that these teams might run into?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's definitely not always a perfectly smooth process. I think one of the biggest challenges is just communication.
Right.
Different disciplines, they often have their own specific vocabularies,
right.
Their jargon, their own ways of framing problems. And so bridging those gaps, you need this real effort in translation, in synthesis, making sure that everyone really understands what others are saying, what their priorities are. It's almost like they're speaking slightly different dialects of the same language.
Right. So it's not even just about avoiding jargon, it's about understanding, the assumptions, the framework that each discipline uses.
Exactly, yeah. And another potential hurdle is power dynamics within the team.
Okay.
There are these traditional hierarchies in the construction industry.
Right.
And sometimes even within specific professions, there can be these power dynamics that might unintentionally marginalize certain voices.
Okay.
Particularly people who come from non-technical backgrounds or people who are newer to the field.
Right.
And so for collaboration to really work well, you have to foster this really egalitarian environment.
Right, where everyone's on an equal playing field.
Yeah, where everyone's voice is heard.
And valued.
Yeah, exactly. And we've seen projects where, maybe there's a very strong-willed architect and they're used to being, the sole visionary, and they struggle to actually cede some control and really listen to the input of, say, a community representative or someone like that. And that can create friction. And it can lead to a less successful design. Right. Then there are always the practical considerations of time and cost.
Right.
These collaborative processes, especially when you're doing, really in-depth early integration, participatory design, it takes more time up front. It takes more resources. And that can be in tension with the commercial pressures.
Right.
The pressure to just get things done quickly.
Right, get the project moving.
Exactly.
Yep.
And naturally, when you bring all these different perspectives together, people have strong opinions, you're going to have disagreements, there can be differences in values and priorities, even in creative vision.
Right.
And so teams need to be able to, resolve conflicts. They need to build trust. They need to be able to, address these disagreements openly and constructively. And then finally, there are always issues about ownership of ideas.
Right.
How do you attribute credit in a team setting?
Right.
So it's really important to have clear protocols around that from the beginning.
Right. Set the ground rules.
Exactly.
But these are all really important points for anyone who's involved in these kind of collaborative projects, or even just observing them to keep in mind. So looking ahead, how do you see this landscape of interdisciplinary design evolving?
Well, I think it's already changing pretty rapidly.
Right.
We're seeing this rise of what people are calling transdisciplinary design.
Okay.
And that goes beyond just integrating existing disciplines.
Okay.
It's about actually creating entirely new fields.
Yeah.
And I think neuroarchitecture is a really fascinating example of this. That's where you're combining insights from neuroscience with architectural design.
Wow.
To understand how buildings actually impact our brains, our well-being. So you're literally designing spaces informed by how they're going to affect our brain activity.
That's a whole other level.
It is. And then, AI artificial intelligence and automation, those are going to have a huge impact.
Right.
Instead of just designing buildings ourselves, we're probably going to be collaborating with AI systems.
Right.
Setting parameters, defining goals for these automated processes, and then working with what the AI comes up with. We're also seeing this really important push towards what people are calling climate and equity-centered collaboration. Driven by all these urgent global priorities around sustainability, around social justice, and there's a growing recognition of the importance of integrating indigenous knowledge and perspectives into the design process.
Right.
And then finally, the tools that we have for global virtual collaboration, they're becoming incredibly sophisticated.
Right.
And that allows teams to co-create in real time across huge distances, so it opens up all sorts of new possibilities for collaboration.
Yeah, it sounds like the future of architecture is going to be even more, interconnected, more responsive, and ultimately more impactful.
Yeah, I think so. I think interdisciplinary collaboration has really gone from being something that was nice to have to something that's absolutely essential.
Right.
And that's really because of the complexity of the problems that we face.
Right.
And so I think to create really successful and meaningful architecture in the 21st century,